and I won't say anything because it's none of my business, but obviously I need to show up my face in the meeting,
Yeah, so Roland's value he's adding is simply his presence, not any ideas, not any improvements. He
JM,
just shows up.
This will not our outtake. This will not be our outtake. Not at all.
Oh, will it not be our outtake? Are you telling me what the outtake is going to be?
We're gonna get divorced, my friend. I will throw this ring into the depth of Mordor. Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast, where we demystify enterprise architecture and business process management.
We're here to bring best practices and lessons learned from our years to your ears, as well as interviewing friends we've met along the way on our professional journeys.
My name is Roland Wolt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson. Hey, JM, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Roland. It's an exciting day. I know a lot of Americans don't know this, but it's upcoming Canadian Thanksgiving when we're recording this. Yeah, I know. We have our own day. It's funny. I always have the same negotiation where I'm like, oh, well, it's Thanksgiving. And everyone's like, what? Not for a long time. And I'm like, well, up here it is. And they're like, does it have to be, though? We have meetings on Monday.
I have to admit, it's better here. It's on a Thursday by definition. So Fridays are typically super slow, or you got off, or whatever. So that's very convenient. That's very
so the question is, does Canadian Thanksgiving include turkey and overeating?
Oh, absolutely. More importantly, though, you cover that turkey in maple syrup, and then you serve it with mousse. I think that's how it works.
Is it a side of mousse, or is it mousse juice that you just put on top of it?
It's a mousse duckin. That's what we call them. It's fine. Mousse duckin. Yeah. So you put the duck inside the turkey, inside the mousse. That's how it works. How you been doing, my friends?
The mousse in the turkey.
Yeah. Wow. I don't think you understand how sizes work. We got this episode off to a great start. Hey, folks, we're excited to have our good friend Mike Schank back. And Roland, I mean, you've been talking about this topic for a long time, but tell me a little bit more about why you think this is such an important time to talk about GRC from a process perspective.
Oh, you mean why we have Mike on the show, or why we talk about this topic? Sorry,
in general.
Oh, in general, yeah. So I think it's very important because I just read yesterday that one of the big Canadian banks, the Toronto and Old Dominion Bank, just got, I don't know, Mike, did they get fined, or did they just got pulled in for it and said, we did money laundering,
I think it was a $3 billion fine, which is, I don't know about your bank account, but to me, that's a lot of money.
No, you're an author. Mike, you're an author. You have that.
Well, I think it was the lack of strength of anti-money laundering controls in place. But what I will say is that you're absolutely right, Roland. Right now, there's a lot of regulatory obligations on organizations, particularly large financial ones. And I think, Mike, you'll make the case today, probably quite successfully, that not all of those regulations the bank is properly set up to comply with. And as a result, they end up writing off huge sums of cash. So let's get introduced, though. I know people who have been coming over this show a few times have seen and heard our good friend Mike Schank, but for those who, for some reason, haven't had a chance to hear him before, Mike, tell us a little bit more about who you are, and welcome to the show again.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. Second time. So I'm a lifelong consultant. I was at Accenture for 13 years. I was at EY for 10, and I spent some time at Bank of America and Citibank. The last role was head of process excellence for the U.S. retail bank. In my time at consulting, I really fell in love with this topic of process, and I became the head of process excellence for EY. And in that time, I developed this kind of process inventory, process taxonomy framework, and I developed a full playbook. And good thing about consulting is I was able to take it to different transformation scenarios. So defining a strategy, defining IT architecture, running a transformation program, and risk management. So while I've never been in a risk role per se, I've always been the guy running the process team in support of it. So I'm a big believer that, and we'll talk through this, that process is the key to risk management success.
Yeah, we're still hoping that we can get a real auditor on the show, not just the fake ones like you and I, because I did that work too in a previous life. But I think, Mike, which makes you completely qualified for this is obviously not only that you worked in banks,
Yep.
and have seen it. But I agree with you. The process twist is a key thing that a lot of risk and compliance implementations simply forget.
Exactly.
But speaking of that, if you think about how organizations and banks, specialty, go to that topic, what is the structure that you typically see in those organizations? And by the way, is there a difference between risk management and compliance management?
Great question. So a typical model is the 3 lines of defense. So the first line is your business unit. Those are the process owners and the people that have to know their processes, understand what their risks are, identify controls, and most importantly, execute on those controls in a rigorous way. Then there's the second line, which is the risk oversight function. And that typically breaks out by your risk taxonomy. So you'll have an ops risk team, a compliance risk team, a resiliency team, maybe a third-party vendor risk management team, but they understand their risk type, they define policies, and then they work with the second line to make sure that the right risks are identified and the prioritized controls are in place. And then there's the third line, which is internal audit. And their role is and they're an independent function. In many cases, they report directly to the board. But their job is to test the effectiveness of controls. And in fact, I've seen in a lot of cases where internal audit teams will do process modeling, because while their forte is testing controls, they don't know what the business does. So they're kind of forced into that where that clarity is not available anywhere else.
Interesting. So with those 3 lines of defense, they feel like they are they independent of each other? Are they dependent on each other for the content that they're producing? Like, how do they relate to each other, and how do they create a practice as a consolidated sort of 3 things that are happening about the same thing?
Yeah. So it's a great point. So they're independent functions. They report to different leadership and have different roles. But obviously, they're looking at the same business. So and a big theme that you'll hear from this is they need to understand the context of the business so that they can understand where controls live and how to control them. So they really need to be working off the same data and be aligned from that perspective.
Which is a challenge, because what I've seen in my limited exposure in a couple of organizations for a couple of years is that there typically is a disconnect. You see the risk people doing their stuff in an Archer or metric stream and whatnot, and they say, oh yeah, we need processes, right? And then they come up with something. And then the business units don't necessarily feel represented in that breakdown. But before we go into this, and that obviously will be the meat of the show, talking about process, let's go back to those programs, right? Where do you see those programs struggle? And process might be one thing, but I'm pretty sure there are other areas where they struggle as well.
I think the first one, well, you touched on one of them and I saw a survey from one of the big 4 consulting companies that reported that 50% of organizations struggle with roles and responsibility between the first and second line of defense. I think the big thing is risk data. So if you go into a GRC, obviously it's a data model, which has what's my business context? What are my risks in that business context? So what are my controls? And then how do I monitor those controls? In the business context, I think is where everyone struggles, because most organizations use a generic taxonomy like an APQC process classification framework. Well, the problem is, and I was at a large bank, is if you anchor all your risk assessments to that, your retail bank looks vastly different from how your mortgage is operated, which is vastly different than your credit card, which is vastly different than your wealth management. So when teams are doing risk assessments, now they're looking at this generic taxonomy, like, well, this doesn't look like my business, so I'm going to do a bunch of interpretations. I'm going to think what I do here attaches to this APQC process or here, et cetera. So there's a lot of interpretations built into the data, which means that there's a lot of, frankly, bad data in these GRC platforms. And there's a lot of confusion. So when I was at Citi, one of the things I did was create a full process inventory, and we got about 75% of the way to the U.S. retail bank. But the good thing of that is we were able to take now the process taxonomy that we heard from the business and that they attested to, and we're able to take the risks and controls from their GRC and say, okay, let's map it to the true process that happens on the ground. And we found a bunch of gaps, a bunch of people are like, I don't even know what this control is. No identification of ownership of who needs to execute that control. And I think that's the root cause of the operating model issues, the reporting issues too. So there's a lot of, I saw this other survey that said 84% of CEOs are concerned with the quality of the data that they're making decisions on. That data has to be rolled up. And a lot of, for U.S. public companies, the Securities and Exchange Commission has mandated that boards have a risk oversight function. So they need a good and accurate picture of what the risk environment looks like. But if the underlying risk data is poor, then that's not going to happen.
And I think the challenge that I've seen, and I've worked with, I think they're a top 5 bank here in the US for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. It was not only the process, right? So yes, you have your process decomposition up to a certain mm-hmm. level. And yes, they made the mistake to say, oh yeah, opening an account is opening an account everywhere, right? Not seeing that opening an IT account is something different than opening a mortgage account or a credit card, And then they also didn't understand that, well, the process might be different. For your credit card account, you might go into a branch, you might do it online, you might send your carrier pigeon, whatever the means is, the process is different. And therefore, obviously, the risks are different. The second thing that I've seen there is and that's maybe on the second line in their case, they had a risk decomposition and they just skipped a level, right? So they broke it down to level 1, 2, 3, and then they said, oh yeah, we have the localized level on level 5.
Yes.
Right. So that means one branch, one area of the organization called it risk of open shoelaces, and the other called it risk of tripping over your own feet. Right?
Yes.
They both meant the same.
Yes.
Right. But they did not have that fourth level, that aggregated view, and that made it super hard.
Yes.
Which Mike, I enroll. This is a really good point here. Because this is the kind of thing that might be solved by a practice, but in a risk scenario, like Mike, how do you see the practices being managed? Do you see them as truly centralized functions that are like global control so we can manage the standard of deviation? So it's like, oh yes, we'd like to declare account opening, but here is how you declare account opening in your context. Or is it just managed by line of business or completely segmented? How have you seen it set up? And tell me some of the strengths and weaknesses of truly bringing risk into a centralized function or truly allowing risk to be in the line of business.
Yeah, I think I see the centralized, decentralized, I think really depends on the level of regulatory oversight that the organization has. So if you're heavily regulated, then you need that centralized group so that they could do common reporting and look across. And in some lower regulated industries, it could be decentralized. I think to your point, Roland, when I do a process inventory or process taxonomy, I name whatever the process is that the business calls it because they ultimately have to take ownership of it. So I want to use the language that they use. But that's where something like an APQC or a business capability model comes in because it could give you, and those are defined as one taxonomy across the organization. But if you can map your I trip over my shoelaces, or I forgot the other thing you said, map that to a common process in your generic taxonomy. Now you could look across and you could say, what's my common risk profile for account opening? And account opening, especially in the bank, is one of the most complex processes around because it's the first point that you start a relationship with that customer. And that brings in your anti-money laundering. It brings in your know your customer, your OFAC checks, all the things that you need to know. Who is this customer? Can I trust them? Am I legally allowed to do business with them? So it's important to really understand that profile across so that you're consistent in how you open accounts in different lines of businesses.
So, Mike, if I understand you correctly, then obviously the key for doing the proper mapping is obviously something like an integrated business-oriented risk management program. And the core of it is a process inventory, even though I would like to say even a level deeper to say to have the individual who does what, when, where process diagrams underneath. But where do you see, I don't know if it's a challenge, where do you see the struggles and the activities to implement this in an organization? Because it's not just a thing where somebody just says, oh, yeah, tomorrow we're going to do this.
So I think it starts with a vision. So, and I spent almost my entire career in financial services, and I've seen a lot of organizations try to do process. If you guys probably know as well. But you need to have a vision for how you're going to construct this, how it's going to be high quality, how it's going to be the foundation. So that's, and you have to dedicate the leadership commitment and the investment to creating a process capability. So you need a team of people that go out to the business, that create these taxonomies, that align ownership, that do data integration. So, and we'll talk about different risk types like ops resiliency and third party, but there's a lot of operational data in your environment around what systems are running on each process, what third party vendors, et cetera, what controls are aligned to it. So you need a team to manage that. And that team has to have an uber focus on rigor and quality so that everyone can trust what's being created.
And it makes sense. And particularly when you're looking at gathering that data, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of operationalizing it, but when you're looking at gathering that data around things, these people are empowered by, I'm assuming, a mandate or a sort of an executive sponsor to be able to extract that data from various people. This is something that I'm assuming has a lot of people with the skills to pull information out of systems and to conduct reasonable interviews. Where do you see people struggling to achieve like that data capture, that effective data capture, to get a level of certainty on the information that they're receiving?
Yeah, I think it's all in the methodology of how you create it. So a lot of organizations I've seen that when they do process modeling, they attach it to APQC, which is a generic taxonomy, which gets real confusing when you're trying to understand what each individual line of business does.
Yeah.
In the methodology that I do, it's an interview process. And there's a lot of automated ways. There's AI, there's process mining and there's a ton of documentation, but everything is incomplete. Nothing is connected. So I really think you still have to do an interview process. And the interview process is you start at the top of an organization. You ask a simple question, what is it that you do? And then you go down to their teams and you go down to their teams until you feel like you've captured the right level of process details. And then I always have my teams do formal attestations bottom up. Do you agree that this is accurate and complete? And I capture some kind of electronic proof of that in an email workflow, something that says, yes, I agree, this is accurate and complete. Go to their leadership. Now I have everyone in the organization saying, this is what my business unit does. And then now I could take that taxonomy that's in your process documentation tool, like your ARIS or whatnot, and I can extract it and I can move it into and I could import it into my GRC and make that the core of my GRC data model.
Yeah, that's the consultant speaking out of you, getting deliverable acceptance, which makes complete sense.
Yeah.
I don't want to belittle it. It makes completely sense. But
if your business partners don't trust that it represents their business, you've already lost the battle before you've started.
Oh, I do the same. I literally want to hear the verbal yes. And then I follow up.
Yeah.
It's like in the emergency row in the aircraft. Are you willing to help in a case of emergency? Yes. But it's what you're talking about to bring it back is obviously the design aspect of it, which is needed. Don't get me wrong, right? You need to have that alignment and all that stuff. But obviously, there's the performance aspect of it. So it's great that you have those risks identified, but Mike, unfortunately, you spent 99% of your time of all that stuff that never happens, but you missed that one big thing that gave us a 3 billion fine. How do you balance this? How do you identify those quote unquote big hitters? How do you bring in that I don't know, in the lack of a better term, risk performance data into your approach, into your analysis?
Well, there's performance data on a lot of organizations capture monitors of controls. So you could absolutely pull this data in and understand, once you have clarity on what your processes are, now you could better collect the performance of your control data and then build a dashboard or some other mechanism to view across your process landscape, who's doing well, who's doing not. I'll jump into a little bit of a story. So, and this is all public information, but Citibank in 2020 had the Revlon issue. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, But a lower level analyst, operational analyst, was supposed to pay Revlon's lender, and this is a syndicate loan, just the interest on a $900 million loan. He fat fingered something in the wire platform and sent the entire principal and interest, $900 million. That triggered, some of the lenders gave the money back. Some of them didn't. They're like, they didn't trust the financial state of Revlon. So it triggered a bunch of lawsuits. And fast forward, the regulators, the OCC and the Fed, fined Citi $400 million fine. And then they ended up launching a massive control transformation program. And I saw this publicly reported. At one point, they were reporting there's 30,000 people working on this. So ouch. I bring this up to say you have a platform that's capable of sending out $1 billion wire. And if you know wires, once you hit send, there's no recovering. It's gone. And I look at that and I think the risk teams literally lost sight of that process. Because if you know your platform is capable of sending $1 billion payment, you have appropriate checks and balances on that. So I think that just stresses the point that you need to understand what your processes are and truly understand where the risks live.
And those processes are also in systems, as you mentioned, the wire. It's not, somebody is not doing this entirely manual, which means you're building an architecture or a capability that is focused on helping to execute against controls. To me, it sounds like you're not talking about process only. You're talking about an interconnected web of sort of operational realities of application systems, of best practices, of, governance systems within the organization and those requirements around that. Those are all things you already have. So when you're looking at this, you're talking about the interconnectivity between process, architecture, and risk. How do you manage the, how do I say this gracefully? The person who gets to dictate the path.
What do you mean by dictate the path? Like,
does risk tell process how it ought to operate? Does risk inform architecture as to how the systems must be constructed? Or what is that relationship? How do you negotiate that? And particularly when you're looking at it in the context of building a process inventory that ties to application, that ties to capability, how do you manage the as Roland likes to say, the one throat to choke? Who's in charge?
Yeah, well, it takes a strong leader at the top of the organization to see this champion and sponsor it. I think from there's probably a couple independent roles, but there's obviously a lot of collaboration. So I see a process center of excellence or process capability. First and foremost, they have to capture what the processes are, just as they are current state. And then attach all this information, your systems, your people, your third-party vendors, your controls, really create, and this goes to systems thinking, understanding that these organizations are complex and that there's a lot of parts of the organizations. They're all connected. They're all interdependent. So that organization needs to build the picture of how this works and really what you're creating is a single source of all operational intelligence. Now, the risk teams have to come in and identify, given the current state, where are the controls. But that's where the collaboration works because they can prioritize the risks and prioritize the controls. And then now the IT teams could come in. Your operational excellence teams that are looking for efficiency could come in. But everyone's working off the same common language of the same business context. And that's where collaboration really can excel. And we all know of organizations with silos that don't talk to each other and dysfunctionality in these large organizations. And I think this breaks that cycle.
Well, I can hear lots of people out there wincing when you say dysfunctionality. And I think in our second section, we're going to get a chance to actually address some of these challenges by building practices. But until then, folks, think about how your organization manages risk. Do they incorporate the business context? Do you have a method of capturing key information, managing that information, and then creating action plans to help you prevent some of the risks through effective controls within your organization? We'll leave you for a moment and come back with our second section, the how.
And welcome back. Mike, very interesting conversation so far. And I think there's a couple of takeaways from our first segment. And I would love you to repeat basically the three things why organizations should think about a process inventory in the context of their risk and compliance management activities, because I think it's so valuable that you have those three things printed out, nailed on a board above your headboard to say, okay, this is what we want to accomplish.
Yeah. So let me start with, I've been talking about this term called business integrated risk management. And the business part is in ISO 31000 defines risk as the uncertainty of achieving objectives. Well, how do you achieve objectives? Through processes, right? So I think to have a strong management function, three things. You need to build a process capability that is aligned with your risk management teams, that's creating that business context, that foundation. You need to create a process taxonomy that is in line with what each individual business unit does and all the specifics and all the nuances. And third is you need to orient your entire risk operating model and your risk data to this process inventory so that everyone's looking at the same view of business context and the processes in individual businesses.
And this seems like a good application of that mandate and power we talked about a little bit before, where you're like, hey, I'm going to spend this trying to bring us all around the same fire. Yep. And so now we can have that communication and we can negotiate how the practice is going to work. But we know we're dealing with the same information. We know that when we change that information, we can all see it. And we know that when we try and act on the information we have, we're all starting from the same place.
Exactly.
And that seems like a really powerful tool. So then now we're going to start to talk about the cost of that and how you justify creating that, because you talk a lot about these things in what I would consider to be right now the consultant speak, as Roland said, the soft value. Well, let's talk about the actual value that you would pitch to make a tectonic shift for some organizations to have that process inventory as a central point. So where do you see business integrated risk management delivering value? How do you justify that value? Or how do you talk about it with the key stakeholders?
Yeah, well, I think that's actually an easy question because you just need to scan the headlines and look at all the regulatory actions and fines. Every day we talked about TD Bank and their $3 billion AML fine. We talked about Citi with the $400 million consent order. And they just got hit with another $136 million fine. Fast forward 4 years later, where the regulator's like, you guys have made no progress on your control environment. And in fact, the COO just got relieved of his transformation duties because he's made no progress on cleaning up their risk data. So, and I could go on and on. There's a ton of, and we could even go outside of financial services, things like Enron or 2008 or et cetera. So if you look at it in the context of the pain, and a lot of these organizations have very massive risk management programs. There's a lot of people running around doing this. So it's the cost of not doing it. What's the cost of doing it? You stand up a process center of excellence, you dedicate some commitment to this topic and detail all your processes versus the fine. I think it's much easier just to do the right things in the first place, get your house in order, and then excel in risk management. And we even talked about the regulatory environment, which is growing massively every day. We could talk about DORA in EU or CPS 230, or there's regulations are in a massive growth trajectory, and that's not slowing down.
Yeah, so Mike, I agree. If I see $1 gazillion as a fine, what are a couple of millions for tools and people and effort and whatnot? Because
exactly,
you also have to say that the government is also gracious on the timeline. They don't say you have to have this tomorrow. They say, oh, show us a plan first. And then once we agree on the plan, well, then show me the milestones, and then they check if you met the milestones. So why is it then why those organizations struggle? Because I'm pretty sure it's not all criminals who have bad intent working in those organizations, but there might be other reasons for this. What in your experience, why do they struggle? Are they too big? Is it too complex? Is it the approach? What is it that makes them
In some cases, it's too big and complex, but I think it's the approach. I think some of these organizations are massive and they're massively complex, and people only look at the world from their horse blinders of what they can see, but they can't look across. And getting everyone aligned to building and executing on a strong risk program where you understand what's your business context, what are your true risks, how do you report on it, I think is a massively complex challenge. And I've seen organizations run transformation programs and continue to struggle. It's mind-boggling, but I think process is the key to getting out of it.
And you talk about the processes is sort of the key to risk management success. That was the opening pitch for this whole episode.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great place to sort of pivot into sort of the how, right? Mm-hmm. Let's get into a lot of the how things. So we manage a bunch of risk types through the common lens of a process inventory and tying things together. Let's talk about those risk types and what you have to do in the context, assuming you have built a practice, to help manage those risk types. And you mentioned them a little bit before, but if you wouldn't mind, let's go into the details.
Yep.
And let's get into the practice of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we could start with ops risk, which is the risk that is incurred from you doing your day-to-day business. So it's really understanding, what do you do? What processes do you execute? What risks are incurred in that? And then how do you control for it? There's compliance risk, which is there's laws, regulations, standards like GAAP, et cetera, that everyone has to comply to. And those are growing on a daily basis. So, with AI tools like Horizon Scans, they could identify what's changing in those laws and regulations and standards. And then the risk and compliance team, or the legal and compliance teams, are typically the ones reviewing those rules and then creating regulatory obligations. If you have your full process inventory defined, now it's just a mapping exercise, mapping the regulatory obligation to the process that needs to control for it. And once you do that mapping, now you could have your 3 lines of defense, your process owners, focused on, okay, what is the control that I need to put in place to meet that regulatory obligation? And then now, once you have that, now you could do better reporting on how am I controlling my compliance risk. And you could actually, I believe you could have a better and more productive set of conversations with your regulators around, okay, what am I missing? Like, I've done this mapping, I've have everything laid out. Where am I missing things so I could avoid the fines? Operational resiliency. So that's a massive data mapping project, because you have to understand, what are all your processes? What are the critical processes that you need to maintain minimum level of operations in a disruptive event? You have to understand, what are all your your Endora, your information communication technology, your ICT, you need to understand all the resources that support those so that IT teams can harden them. They could build in extra, fault tolerance or geographic diversity in data centers or whatever it may be. But now your technology teams understand, your business teams identifying what's the critical processes. Your risk teams is looking at what controls need to be in place. And your technology team is looking at that same bit of information and say, how do I harden my environment for those critical processes? And then there's another component, which is your third-party vendors. So and this gets in the third-party risk management, is understanding where your third parties support your processes, and then going into them and making sure, do you have the right risk management programs? Do you have the right controls in place? And there's been a lot of cases where some vendors had PII information, personal and identifiable information for customers, and then they had data leaks. Well, ultimately, it's the responsibility of third-party vendors. It's ultimately it's your responsibility, because it's your business. When regulation or regulators or lawsuits come, they're not going to look at your third parties. They're going to look at you and hold you accountable. So it's your responsibility to understand how everything connects and making sure you're doing the right things to keep your customers in the market safe.
Yeah, I can see that this is a utterly complex challenge, and I can easily see that you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people in an organization like the banks that you worked for. just being busy with it, which obviously then adds another layer of complexity because somehow you need to manage this little army of people, right? So I can see that. But then still keep in mind, it's for not the greater good, but it's obviously for the customer of those banks, because we're talking money, right? And you don't want to get somebody's life savings being fat fingered away because somebody screwed up, So the ultimate question then is, well, how do you set this up? Because we've spoken about the idea behind it, right? And you mentioned in one of your employers, you mapped 75% of all that stuff, which raises the question for me, what about the other 25?
I left before I could complete.
Oh, so now they're done faster because I get it.
I had this burning desire to write a book. I don't know.
Yeah, and also the 25% you didn't map are the ones you didn't like. I get it. I get it. Don't worry.
but in all seriousness, guys, Mike, how do you set this up? Right? How do you manage that complexity? How do you pull this off? Because I'm pretty sure nobody wants to pay fines in the millions or billions.
Yeah. So I think it's, how do you eat an elephant? You start one bite at a time. So I think it's important, and especially for these large organizations, this could be a daunting and overwhelming thing to take on. I would start first, build your process capability and think through all the roles. Like, you need modelers, you need people to do governance, you need people to manage the tools and the data and everything. But just start with one business unit, map out the processes, align all your risk and controls to that, and start reorienting the different risk teams, your second lines of defense and your internal audit, to that same thing. And then show leadership like, hey, this is a better way to do it. Now we have clean risk data. Now we have better risk reporting. Now our operating model is clear and who's doing what. And then once you could demonstrate that in the show, not tell kind of mode, now you could get agreement to expand this to larger groups. So I think it's all about just demonstrating that this is the winning approach.
Can I actually ask a question about that, Mike? Because I feel like we keep saying the word regulators as if they're omnipotent boogeymen, but they're just human beings.
Oh, for sure.
So when you're setting up a practice and you're creating collateral, and this is continue on the how question, how do you connect your work with the regulator's expectations? Are they coming in with like deep process expertise? Are they deep architecture and enterprise architecture and systems expertise? Like, what are they coming to you expecting? And then how does your practice connect the work that you've done with those expectations or with the requirements? Because it's more than just the text on the page. It's being able to demonstrate that text has been fulfilled. And you said that yourself. Tell me about that process.
I don't believe they're process experts. I don't think they're architecture experts. They're just looking at, here's a set of rules that you need to comply with, and I'm not seeing it, or I see the risk with your customer. I think it's really, you need to demonstrate that you're on top of your environment, that you understand where everything is, that you have good risk processes in place, your data's clean, and that you're controlling your environment. So I think it's really getting on your toes as opposed to your heels and making sure that you are kind of proactive in saying, look, I have this thing completely under control.
Mm-hmm. I hate to be the spoiler here, but we're getting up to the top of our self-imposed episode length here. So I have one more question for you, Mike, because this is one, obviously, for the regulars listening to our show, that's near and dear to my heart. It's obviously, well, you can change technology, you can change processes, but obviously to pull this off, you need to change people, right? And when I look into this context, and maybe it's a twofer question. So one's obviously the people question, but the other one is, if I haven't done this as an organization right now, how long will that take? Right. So what's the effort behind it? Because I think it's not done in 2 weeks. And the people question might be one aspect of it. What are your experiences in those two aspects, time and people?
So first, and I think you mentioned this earlier about the process inventory versus the process names. And a lot of people, when I talk about creating the process taxonomy, they think, oh my God, this is overwhelming. But I would state that I think the process names are more important than the process models. And if you're just looking for what are the names of the processes, this is a relatively easy and fast thing, because I'm just doing an interview process and saying, what are the process names? And then when you want to go into process models, you could create a criteria for what's priority and go into the areas that you need to, like account opening. It's probably one of the most complex processes around, because you're establishing that customer relationship. So, just think about, I need the process names, because that taxonomy becomes an anchor for your GRC data model. So that's first and foremost important. And you could do that in an organization within a matter of weeks, not a matter of months. And then from a culture perspective, I think one thing that's missing is accountability. And I've mentioned in some of these GRCs, it's not even clear who is responsible for the process or the controls. So if you build this taxonomy, when I build it, I put a name at every node, because you don't just own that process. Your boss has some level of ownership. His boss has some level of ownership. So you're creating a hierarchy of accountability. And now you could hold people accountable for what's the status of this control and why is it not working effectively, and get people motivated to make sure they do the right things.
I find that interesting that you said within a couple of weeks, because my experience from that project that I mentioned before, I think we spent like 2 years there. And
a couple of weeks per business unit. So it's obviously you've got to multiply that.
Yeah. I get that. We were just working with retail lending, so it was a subset of it. But either way, we spent not a gazillion. We spent quite an effort on just building the technology. They had like 29 sources of input systems that we wanted to get into the tool, that then we could do that mapping exercise, right? Yeah. So it was just pure technology implementation that we had. So I'm a little bit surprised. So if you had your druthers, Mike, and you would be that poor COO who has to show some progress within 4 weeks, 4 years, right? Yeah. How would you structure that?
I think it all you said the word earlier. It's all approach. So how are you doing this? Like and when you do this interview process, and I've seen a lot of, like with the common taxonomies, there's a lot of religious debates. Don't call it this, call it that, add this, add that. But when you're going into an individual business unit, it's very simple. There's no arguments. Just tell me what you do. And if you have that approach, and typically it's an easy approach. I have teams that go do research of, look, let's read procedure documents or any other documents available. Let's create a first draft, because I never want to walk into an interview with a blank sheet of paper. And then I have the interview and I say, just tell me where I got it wrong. What is it you do? What am I missing, et cetera? And that typically, when you're down at a team level, can happen within an hour. Then I have my teams go back and then they look at all the metadata that you want aligned. So who's the process owner? What's the description of the process? What's the technology? What are the controls? Whatever you define as your critical data elements, and then you ask for sign off. So it's really quick and easy, and there's no religious debates about what's on that paper, because the team knows what they do.
Well, actually, Mike, I wanted to ask a question. You knew this kind of question was coming, because everyone's talking about it right now. We talk about religious debates. We talk about the religion of AI.
Yes.
And you're talking about what appears to have a lot of human effort required, a non-insignificant amount of knowledge, and technology to hook it all together. Advocates for AI will tell everyone who will listen from high up on their pulpit, AI can do this for you.
Yep.
So tell me about what you've seen in the last couple of years with the big popularization of AI, how it's affected the GRC space, whether or not you see it today being able to fast track some of the things or error check some of the things you're talking about, and what you see as the future of GRC and AI together. And let's condense this into, I suppose, 3 minutes.
So I think AI, creating this taxonomy, I think AI could be a big boost. Like it could scan all the procedure documents, all the data, et cetera. But the problem is AI depends on clean data. And data in a lot of these organizations not consistent, not through anyone's fault, but they just didn't have the structure to envision how to put this data together. And ultimately, if you're calling someone a process owner, I think you still ultimately have to have a discussion with them and make sure that they agree that these are the processes. I think jumping forward, and this topic I love, which is digital twins. But ultimately, AI right now, I think, is on the periphery. You could use it to write a better email or look at, a contract and tell you if the terms are favorable or not. Or you could load in your procedure documents, your coaching documents, and you could say, hey, now I have a GPT for my call center, so I could educate them on what to do. But I think the next wave is really educating AI on all the nuances of your business. What are your processes? What are your redundancies? What are your challenges? But if you could build this, and a digital twin is a virtual model of your real world environment, which is backed by an AI engine. So if you could build, and I think process inventory is the foundation for that, specifically in non-physically tangible environments like a bank, like a back office. So if you could build this digital twin and educate it on all your processes, now you could take feeds from your controls. You could take feeds from your customer complaint systems, your issue systems, your process mining. And now it could look for where are you not complying with regulations? Where are you inefficient? Really any metric that you look at from an operating perspective. I think that's the next frontier that I think could really, really power operational excellence in all organizations.
That sounds quite exciting, and I for one am interested to see how that works out. As I agree with you, there are some limited use cases that AI is being well established in right now. But as we want to train it on a digital twin, we need that process inventory to get it started, and that actually turns us back to our audience. Audience, think about this. How much have you had an opportunity to create a process inventory within your organization? So how much does risk and architecture as a practice have a centralized source of information that is trusted, relied upon? And how is that leveraged when it comes to risk and control activities? Do you do governance, risk, and compliance by that mapping exercise Mike talked about before between risk and process architecture? Or are they still seen as separate pillars and in fact, maybe even separate functions, separate parts of the business? And that disconnection causing issues for you. We'll leave you for a moment to reflect on your past, and we will come back with our final thoughts and conclusions for the episode.
And welcome back. Fascinating conversation. I think, JM, I say that every episode, but this was really interesting. So, Mike, thank you for being a guest again on our show.
Thanks for having me again.
You're more than welcome. But the ultimate question is obviously, well, I haven't heard about that Mike guy before. I heard he wrote a book. I haven't seen that book before. How can I get in contact with Mike?
So 3 things. So go to Amazon. The book's called Digital Transformation Success. I have a full chapter on risk management, and I talk about this framework and how to build a process capability and everything. Second, find me on LinkedIn, Michael Schank, and I post a lot on a bunch of topics, including risk management. And then finally, I do have my own consulting company, and I'm rolling out a 3-day training class coming up soon. So you can find me on processinventory.com. And if you're interested in what I'm talking about and maybe you want some of the services, you could certainly reach out to me from there.
That sounds fascinating. Hopefully our audience will go and visit you there, find a little bit more out about you, and perhaps employ your services. But until that time, friends, thank you so much for coming along on this ride with us. Mike, you've been amazing. Roland, I love chatting with you as always. And our audience, we love having you here. We've been getting such amazing feedback. Some really good comments and some likes, some emails. People have been asking us for certain things for us to cover. We love hearing that. More. Tell us what you want. We'll do more of that with ourselves. I think we just crossed another big milestone of listenership. The post went out today of our 40,000th listener, and that's amazing. We really appreciate it. So once again, keep going to whatsyourbaseline.com. And for this episode, even all the show notes will be located on whatsyourbaseline.com, so we can see you there. But until next time, I've been J.M. Erlinson.
I'm Michael Schank.
And I've been Ronald Volt.
And we will see you in the next one.